And we will go ahead and start. So thank you for coming. Got ahead of myself already. Today we're going to talk about stress, sleep, and self-care. And this is going to be kind of a high-level overview. There's a lot of detail in these things that I could talk for hours about them, but I'm going to try to squish it in 30 minutes. So I'll try to leave a few minutes at the end if you have any questions or input, or if anybody has anything to say. Hopefully we can just leave that open. So, my name is Dr. Jane Jenkins. I'm a licensed psychologist in a few states. I've been working with VMHS, Veterinary Mental Health Services, as a facilitator for groups and one-on-one sessions for over 3 years now. And I've also been working as a psychologist in a veterinary teaching hospital for just over 4 years. So I feel like I'm pretty embedded in vet med. However that happened, I'm happy to be there. My PhD focus was also on human animal bond and human animal interactions in the context of psychological services. So I feel like I'm kind of vet med adjacent, so to speak. So today we will talk about stress in general. What is it? Eustress versus distress, because we don't usually differentiate these things. Different types of stress. We're going to focus mostly on chronic stress and the impacts of that. I really like to talk about what's happening in the brain, because science people like to know these things, and I'm fascinated by how the brain operates and what impacts it. We're going to talk about sleep and sleep quality, of course, and then hopefully I can send you away with a few strategies that might be helpful. So first of all, stress. This would be distress, I would say. And I'm sure you can relate to some of these pictures. So what actually is it? So stress is defined by the American Psychological Association as the psychological perception of pressure and the body's physiological response to it. So it's not like a one situation thing. It's our whole body, our whole brain, how we think about it and how it impacts us. So in itself, it's not a bad thing. It is kind of the way that we naturally address and navigate our environment, respond to challenges that might be happening or things that are uncertain. So there are two types of stress. The first is eustress, which is actually helpful. It's very motivating, fuels our successes, helps us achieve, kind of puts pressure on us to grow and reach toward our goals. The EU is you actually means good or well. So an example of that might be euphoria, right? It's a good thing. The other side of it is what we call distress. And we often use distress to define any kind of stress. And that's fine. It's kind of a living room word, so we'll use it that way. But the actual definition of distress, it's helpful and unhelpful. So it fuels our stress response in our brain, so kind of our fight or flight response. It also fuels reminders that we might be powerless in a situation, which isn't helpful. But it can also be motivating, not in a great way. So it's tricky, right? Dis prefix means not. So typically distress is unhelpful. We use it to motivate ourselves. I find this particularly with science-minded people. And I try to combat it as much as I can. But we'll talk about that more as we go on. So eustress versus distress. I really like to differentiate these, so you can start to understand how distress is not helpful for us. So eustress feels like eagerness, excitement, pride. It's motivating. We feel fulfilled. And this can happen in situations like you're starting a new job. It's a little freaky, but it's also exciting, right? Maybe you're adapting to a new culture while traveling. That's a little anxiety provoking, but we feel some eustress in that. So we're motivated to do it, from positive sources. In the short term, we get this energy boost so we can get these things done. It increases focus and effort. In the long term, it helps us keep working when things get hard. So it actually increases perseverance and our ability to stick with something. It leads to an approach behavior. So it stimulates kind of a goal related action. which will be the opposite of distress, as you'll see. And it helps us achieve things that mean things to us, things that are important to us. It also helps us feel good about ourselves, and it grows our confidence. The other side of that is distress. So it feels like hesitance, pressure, anxiety, often comes with overwhelm, difficulty making decisions, and it's very unmotivating. In the short term, it kicks in our fight or flight response, which is our HPA axis. It's not harmful in the short term, but we kind of have to wait for the body to calm down in order to then make decisions and take action. Whereas in eustress, they kind of go hand in hand. Long-term effects of distress are harmful. We get physical and psychological consequences. Heart disease and diabetes are probably the most prevalent. Anxiety and depression are probably the psychological consequences that would first come to mind. It leads to development of like a withdrawal or fear-based response. So we go into something trying to avoid failure instead of reaching for some success with it. So there's a big difference. And it prevents us from having meaningful focus on things that we value, because we're just trying to like get things off our plate because we're avoiding this failure or we're avoiding this negativity, and our confidence suffers because of it. I like to show this graph to kind of show you the difference between helpful stress and unhelpful stress. So this is a bell curve. You've probably seen a bell curve 2 million times, but when we're inactive or we have no stress, we don't have motivation. So there's no motivation to actually like reach and move forward. So we do need some stress to push us forward. And I would call that eustress. When we get to almost like the yellow column, the second column of that curve, when we get to almost the peak, that's optimum stress. That's when we can manage the stress and also perform at the same time. When we get past that, we start to get exhausted. We start to feel like overwhelmed. It's too much. And then that does not work well. And that goes to anxiety, panic, and burnout. So we want to stay somewhat motivated by the eustress, but not push ourselves into distress when we have control. Sometimes we don't have control. We just find ourselves over there in the red zone. And that's when we can recognize and take action to help ourselves. So I like to focus on 3 types of stress. The one is acute stress, which to me is like a capital T, big T trauma. That's an actual traumatic experience where your body reacts to something that you experience or witness or hear about. Symptoms of big T's are lots of emotional distress, muscles tighten, we breathe fast, our blood pressure goes up. So our fight or flight response has been fully engaged. People that don't recover from this might end up with PTSD. That's what a big T traumatic experience is. Many people experience these big T's and recover just fine. So it's not always a recipe for PTSD, but it can be. The second one is very prevalent in the medical field, secondary traumatic stress. It's called episodic acute stress. So we get repeated exposure to these stressors, either big T's or little t's that we'll talk about in a minute. When pressure is too high, demands are too high, symptoms of this actually kind of reflect burnout. So irritability, unintended hostility, difficulty in relationships. You might find yourself checking out in situations. And this is where compassion fatigue can come in, particularly in the medical field. So we want to be aware if these things are happening without relief, right? This is unrelenting pressure, like day in, day out. I say this with a lot of ER folks, a lot of early career folks. Now that corporate vet is kind of taking over quite a bit of practices, there's a lot of pressure to produce. And some folks are not wired for that. So they can experience a lot of this secondary traumatic stress. And then the last one is chronic stress, which we're going to probably talk the most about. And these are little t traumatic experiences. So these are like, it's like long-term exposure to lower grade pressures. So maybe job, family, money, all the things. In some term, I think Dr. Oh, her name's not coming to me right now, but she calls these stacked stressors, which makes a lot of sense because when these stressors stack up, it kind of limits our ability to deal with them. Symptoms of these might be emotional overwhelm, difficulty remembering things, concentrating, sleep difficulties. We might be more reactive than we typically would be. And then underachievement or performance at work, at home, or in other things we're trying to do. BIPOC and LGBTQ folks are at higher risk of this because they're already trying to operate in environments that often are not welcoming for them, or they don't see other people like them. And so they're trying to fit in and navigate. So they're actually at higher risk in these situations for stacked stressors. Some physical and mental indicators might be familiar to you. Fatigue, definitely. We use so much emotional energy when we're trying to manage stress that it makes us lethargic and it takes our energy away. You might be irritable. As I said, memory, concentration might be impacted. You might be sick more frequently. Your immune system cannot operate if you're under stress all the time. And we'll talk about why in just a minute. You might have headaches, body aches, and your sleep is going to suffer. Sleep suffers, stress gets worse. So they kind of go hand in hand. So what is actually happening in the brain? On the left of this graph is the cycle or the response cycle that would happen if you actually experienced a stressor, like a traumatic stressor. So the hypothalamus lets the pituitary know we have a problem. Pituitary sends all kinds of hormones down to the adrenal gland. That activates all the fight or flight things, right? Lots of cortisol running through the system. When the stress or the traumatic situation is over, typically limited stress hormones, which are those red dotted lines, go back to the brain in like this negative feedback loop. And it tells the brain, oh, the stress cycle's complete, the fear is over, we're fine, and then we go back to normal. This is what typically happens in other mammals apart from humans, because they don't have this prefrontal cortex that causes all this worry and stress, right, that we get. In a chronic stress cycle, that same system is activated, but it's activated repeatedly. So then it alters the natural response of getting that negative feedback. So our system becomes oversensitive and it just keeps circulating. So cortisol is getting churned out, catecholamines are getting churned out, and it compounds instead of, like, the stress hormones compound instead of us returning to homeostasis as was actually naturally intended. So perceived chronic threats equal this long-term engagement of our HPA system. It malfunctions and it creates a sustained, what's called an allostatic load. So minimal relief can actually alter your homeostatic baseline, which sounds complicated, but it really isn't. So I'm going to show you a little picture. The top is, if you look at the straight line, that's a balanced mood. That's homeostasis. Typical humans go above it, below it, above it, below it, pretty much consistently. If we get too much pressure and it becomes too frequent, the bottom picture shows, you see the A, B happening so repeatedly that it actually pulls our homeostatic point below baseline. And then our system is off kilter. So then we're more stressed, more vulnerable to stress, less able to downregulate ourselves because our homeostatic point has shifted. We don't want that, obviously. So what are the impacts of stress that don't remit? Like when stress doesn't remit, what happens? We can have mood difficulties, as I said before, anxiety, depression. We can have heart problems, all kinds of cardiovascular problems. We can get sick. Our immune system cannot keep up if we don't recycle. And this is where sleep is going to come in a minute, but we have to downregulate, right? We cannot have cortisol pumping through our system and have a good immune system. We might have digestive problems. A lot of people don't appreciate the connection between the mind and the body. And the gut actually controls more than we ever knew it did. You can have weight gain, too much cortisol, not enough relaxation, stress. Our body's going to keep weight on. And this is moderated by genetics slightly, right? We have individual differences in what we can tolerate naturally. And then life experiences. If you have past traumatic events, that increases your vulnerability to chronic stress. So we want to keep an eye on that and kind of have compassion for yourself and know that that may be a factor. Checking my time, doing pretty good. So let's talk a little bit about sleep. Sleep is fascinating. So if you're not familiar, we have 5 stages of sleep. The first 4 are non-REM. The last is REM. And a sleeper will pass through all stages approximately every 90 minutes. And then these REM periods increase in length as the night progresses. So on average, an adult should have about 20% of REM sleep per night. So you can imagine if you don't go to sleep well, or if you have interrupted sleep, how that's going to impact these cycles. And then there's a thing called the REM rebound. If you go several nights with inadequate sleep, then your brain will try to compensate for this lost REM by spending more time in REM. And that's why you might wake up like extra tired, even though you had a lot of sleep. Your body's trying to get more REM cycles in, but you can't actually catch up on sleep. Once it's lost, it's lost. So all you can really do is try to then reestablish a good sleep cycle. So stages 1 and 2, we have light sleep with lots of brain activity. Stages 3 and 4, we go into a deep sleep. It's more difficult to wake up. We probably dream in the state, but you won't remember these. And then as we go into stage 5, we have rapid eye movement, and this is where all the repair actually happens. So you'll have dreams you remember, which is fine. But what's important is that your heart rate and your breathing are fast and irregular, because your brain is doing a lot of work to downregulate and reset you. So here's what happens. It helps you retain memories. It helps you retain things you learned. It cleanses beta amyloids during sleep, which are super duper important to get rid of. Your immune system recharges because everything downregulates. Everything slows down. So your cortisol resets, epinephrine goes down, resets, lets your immune system recharge and kind of gets you ready for the next thing. So if we talk about optimal sleep versus poor sleep quality, most people need about 8 hours of sleep to repair kind of the damage of wakefulness. I do have a friend or two who need 4 to 5 hours. Good for them. That is not typical for most people. We do have about a 16-hour, what they call recycle rate, where we're okay. After that, we start seeing significant mental and physical deterioration. So after 19 hours of no sleep, if you've experienced this, you are actually comparable to someone who's legally intoxicated mentally. That's what happens to your mental capacity. And if it goes more than that, it's worse. Of course, there are individual differences, as I said, but on average, we need 7 to 8 hours. And anything over 16 hours of not sleeping, you're not productive. Your medical errors are going to go up because you don't have the cognitive capacity to do what you can do when you're at optimal sleep. Just to normalize things, 1 out of 3 adults does not get enough sleep. And then poor sleep quality, as I said before, if we have this fragmented sleep, then the brain cannot clear the toxins well. Long-term effects of that are enlarged perivascular spaces. Perivascular spaces are the spaces around the ventricles in your brain. And trouble with these areas are related to cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, early onset dementia. So we really want to take care of our brains, and sleep is the way to do that. Some effects of sleep deprivation. I'm going to look over to my notes to the right. So if I'm not looking at the camera, that is why, because there's so much information. So your central nervous system, 10% less sleep reduces your cognitive abilities, and sleep deprivation prevents us from making new memories. It can feel like amnesia. Regarding the lymph nodes, 1 night of 4 to 5 hours of sleep equals a 70% reduction in anti-cancer fighting immune cells. It's amazing how closely related sleep and our functioning are. The pancreas shows increased risk for type 2 diabetes with sleep deprivation. The heart, 6 hours of sleep or less per night increases your risk of fatal heart attack or stroke in your lifetime by 20%. So this is really important stuff. Interrupted sleep leads to chronic muscle aches, decreased reactions because there's no cell regeneration when we're not sleeping. All this happens while we sleep. And then just fun facts. Men who sleep 5 to 6 hours a night have the same testosterone levels of someone 10 years older than them. That is wild, right? And we do a global experiment every time we do our daylight savings, which is coming up soon. During spring, when we lose 1 hour, there's a 24% increase in heart attacks the following day. So sleep is super important. This is probably clear by now, right? So what are some things that you can do? First, we're going to go over sleep hygiene first, and then look at a few self-care things. So I have this laundry list of sleep hygiene strategies that I've used with students for years. Number one is you use the bed only for sleeping or intimacy. We want to really establish a bed and sleep association for the brain. The brain needs to know when I'm going to go to bed, I'm going to go to sleep. And it's super important. Reduce awake time in bed, obviously, based on number one. If you're not sleepy, get out of the bed. If you're not sleepy, you're going to have fragmented sleep. You're not going to get the removal of toxins and what you need from sleep. So get up. You can read, write, draw, play calming music. Avoid trying to fall asleep because it actually increases your brain arousal. It's the opposite of what we want. But you can be in bed, and when your mind is going all other directions, thinking about 25 things that you can't do anything about, but we do it anyway, we can do a few things. So I do 4-7-8 breathing. So you breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold it for 7, and then you let a really long breath out for 8 seconds. Does a couple things. It downregulates your physical body, tells your brain, oh, we're relaxing. And it also is a mindful activity. And so it gets rid of some of that noise, all that outside feedback. You can also do progressive muscle relaxation. And there's a mindfulness activity called Leaves on a Stream that you can easily Google or email Katie or myself, and we can get it to you. Also help you stay in the moment and let your body fall asleep. Put your alarm out of sight. This works for some people, not all. Time pressure can make sleep a lot harder. And a time-free environment can actually reduce worry. So if you're the kind of person that those might affect, think about that one. Definitely avoid caffeine drinks after 6. Probably something you already know. It prevents sleep and it causes fragmented sleep, as does cannabis use late at night, and also alcohol, unfortunately. We don't get the REM sleep that we want or need, and so it gets fragmented, which is why you might feel tired when you wake up. If you're hungry, eat something. Don't go to bed hungry. Also, don't have a big meal before you go to bed. So eat something light. Your gut will work, but not too hard, and it might help you sleep. Explore napping. Some people can actually power nap and do quite well. Make sure that it doesn't interfere with your actual bedtime sleeping, though. Schedule stress or worry time. I do this with lots and lots of people. It sounds kind of wonky, but it actually works. If your brain knows when you're going to focus on something, it kind of will let you have a break. But you have to be serious about it. So if you're going to look at it tomorrow morning and that's what you say, then you think about it tomorrow morning, just like you planned, because your brain will not forget about it. You can also wake up and have a pad by your bed so you can write down things you're worried about so you don't forget them. Your brain knows you've handled it and you might be able to go back to sleep. Sometimes we can just ask ourselves, well, when we wake up worrying, is that something that I can or need to fix right this minute? Almost always that answer is no. You're in bed, it's the middle of the night. So sometimes when we just say, no, I can handle that tomorrow, we can actually get relief from it and go to sleep. No screens in bed. It's a super duper bad idea. Couple of reasons. Blue lights interfere with melatonin, increase cortisol, interfere with melatonin that should be at its height when you're trying to go to sleep. So it interferes. The second reason is because even without the blue lights, you don't realize it because we can't tell, but electronics actually arouses our brain. So we're not going to sleep. So that's why all of a sudden you've been on your phone, you're thinking for 10 minutes because you can't sleep, and all of a sudden it's an hour and a half. It's because your brain is aroused. So if you can avoid that, avoid that. There's also sleep training you can do. I've done this with a few people. It's a little intense, but it can work. I've used, it's called CBTI. It's cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Might be something to check out as well. So let's move on to self-care. When we look at the glasses, we don't often think about keeping the glass on the right full. We often think about what is draining the glass to empty on the left, or, oh my goodness, my glass is only half full at the moment. So if we can get into a mindset of refilling that glass as much as possible, that can be helpful. It's not an end all because there are some things you can't control and some things in your environment that are going to keep draining your glass that you can't control. But we do have some agency in some things we can do for ourselves. For example, here's a self-care wheel with 4 very important topics on it. So you can look over that. My personal preferences are use the time you have right now, wherever you are. We often try to wait until we have time to do something for ourselves. So we're not going to do this at the end of this. We're going to do this right now. So if you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes during the day, can you go outside and just sit and be quiet if you like to be outside? Can you just pet a dog? Whatever brings you a little bit of joy and helps you focus on just you for those few minutes can be really helpful. Try to think about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Growth mindset would be, I can get through this. I can learn. I can change this. I might be able to do this. I don't know this right now, but I will know it and it will get easier for me. Whereas a fixed mindset is more, I can't change anything. It'll never be different. I'm just going to get worse and worse. It really locks us in kind of that no control space. And that is usually not super helpful. Next, intentionally downregulate. I sort of mentioned this with our 10, 15, 20-minute thing, right? Mindfully walk somewhere. Mindfully means slow down, feel the pavement under your shoes, engage your senses, right? What do I see? What do I hear right now? What kind of birds are out there? What kind of flowers are blooming, if any? Has it started snowing? I imagine that's coming for me pretty soon. What's happening around me? And really pay attention to that. If you have a dog or an animal pet that you walk, they're really good at it. So just watch them and do what they do. We can also do this driving. We can do this riding our bikes. Another thing we can do is to downregulate during the day by relaxing tense muscles. We can relax tense muscles by rolling our shoulders, by doing nose circles, because stress cannot stay in relaxed muscles. And then allow for work-home transition time. For a lot of my folks, I will make an agreement that when they close the door of the car to drive home, that's the transition noise. And then they transition to, what am I going to do when I get home? I wonder what's happening at home, and kind of trying to leave work at work as much as possible. I know that's really hard with that med, but there's probably nothing you can do from the car to the trip home that's going to make any difference. So take that time for yourself. And then we can do grounding exercises. The bottom one, recognizing your small wins, can change your whole mindset as you walk in the door when you get home. What did I do well today? Did I show up on time? Did I just get through my day? Sometimes that's all it is, right? Recognize what you did well, because often we're criticizing ourselves and not recognizing what we did. Did we help someone? Did we help a pet? Like, what were you able to do today that you can be proud of? And here are some real self-care versus fake self-care tips for you. You can see stark differences. Be kind to yourself versus talking critically to yourself is probably my favorite one. We always want to boss ourselves into being that person we want to love. We can't do that. And then boundaries. know your own boundaries and hold them. Saying nice to everybody because you're trying to be a nice person, that just gives people who want to take advantage of you the opportunity to take advantage of you. It's okay to say no kindly. And then spend time with people that you actually like. You don't have a lot of free time. Spend that time with people that you actually like, or maybe animals you actually like. And then finally, self-compassion. I can never say this enough. The 3 pillars of self-compassion can guide your life in a whole different way. Self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So in a situation that's super stressful, we just say, this is really difficult for me. That's all we're saying. We're not judging it. We're not getting down ourselves for it. Just, this is really difficult. And then with common humanity, we're going to connect to shared humanness by saying, I deserve and need self-care just like everyone else does, because they do. And then be mindful. We're just being aware of how we feel, and that's okay. I feel stressed, and that is okay. So I'll work toward just okay being. If I can have well-being right now, I'll just be okay. And we're not having any expectations about it. So here are some references for you. And of course, thank you for sharing your time with me. If you want any more information about the VMHS or groups or individual sessions, Dr. Katie Lawler can certainly guide you. She's the rock of the whole thing and a wonderful, wonderful human. So I'm going to stop sharing and stop recording.